Hey, welcome back to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
Today, we are digging into a single and frankly pretty provocative document. It tackles a complex and, well, controversial idea.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's all about applying this concept of parasitism to different groups within society, and specifically through a certain political lens.
Right. And we've just got this one source document to work from today.
Exactly. So our mission, like always on the deep dive, it's straightforward. Just unpack the arguments and perspectives laid out only in this specific source. We want to understand how this document uses that term, parasite, and explore the implications the author is getting at.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be absolutely clear, especially because this stuff is so politically charged, we are solely here to understand and convey the ideas in this text to you, the listener.
That's crucial. We're not endorsing, not agreeing, just presenting what the source says impartially. Think of us as guides through this text.
Okay, perfect. So let's dive in. The document starts by presenting an initial claim, right?
It does.
Yeah.
It jumps right in by stating that those on what it calls the traditionalist or genuine right often use that label parasitical for certain groups in society.
Okay, so who does the source identify? Who is typically targeted with that label from this specific perspective laid out in the text?
Well, the text is quite specific there. It points to racial or ethnic minority groups, particularly those described as being of immigrant stock.
Immigrant stock, okay.
And the core claim, as presented in the source, is that these groups arrive and, well, they tend to quickly access government assistance programs.
So welfare, things like that.
Yeah, things which then heavily subsidize or sometimes even fully cover their living costs in, Western countries.
Got it. So the source kicks off focusing on financial reliance. What other reasons does the document give for this parasite label being applied to immigrants from this viewpoint?
Okay, so the source outlines several layers here. It argues these groups benefit from Western permissiveness and cultural tolerance. But according to the source, they don't offer reciprocity. It doesn't feel like a two-way street to the author.
Reciprocity.
How so? It specifically mentions the Islamic faith, claiming individuals attempt to impose their own cultural and religious values instead of, integrating or adopting the host culture's norms.
So according to the source, it's not just about financial support, but also this perceived one-way street culturally, like taking but not giving back in that sense.
Exactly, and the source's framing. The document also claims that these immigrants perceive Western nations as inherently evil.
Evil. Why?
Citing historical actions like colonization and slavery. But simultaneously, the source argues they see these same nations as weak and without identity.
Evil, but also weak and identity-less. That's quite a combination presented there. And how does that perception translate, according to the document?
Well, the source claims this leads to the view that these Western nations exist basically to be looted and reformed.
Looted and reformed. Wow.
So you have this combination in this document of perceived financial dependence and this cultural or historical resentment driving that parasite label.
That's a really strong set of claims presented in the source. Now, what's maybe surprising is the author's own stance on the behavior they've just described. How does the author of this document actually view the actions of these immigrants?
Yeah, this is where it gets interesting. The author states they do not blame these immigrants for this behavior.
They don't blame them after describing it that way.
No. According to the author, it's because this is genuinely how these immigrants perceive the West, as weak, guilty, and sort of there for the taking. The author also notes that, in their view, the state itself is unwilling to penalize this behavior.
And what about the author's level of personal concern? Are they outraged by the actions of the foreigner?
The source makes it clear the author is actually less concerned with the foreigner's conduct than with internal issues in their own nation.
Really?
Yeah. The author believes these foreigners shouldn't be living in Western countries in the first place, but acknowledges, look, they currently are and they likely will continue to. There's a direct quote here that's quite telling. The conduct of the foreigner, morally speaking, is of little concern to me.
Of little concern to me. That statement really stands out, doesn't it? A lack of moral concern for the actions of the group they've just, through this presented viewpoint, labeled as parasitical based on those very actions.
It's a striking position.
Right. Now, here's where the source takes a truly interesting, maybe unexpected turn. It pivots. It asks a question about a completely different group.
Yes, this is really the core provocative move of the document, I think. After establishing this application of parasite to immigrant groups, the source then turns the lens right back on the very people often making those claims. the traditionalists themselves.
Uh,
It raises the question, are traditionalists, too, potentially parasitical?
that feels like a fundamental paradox built into the source's argument. How does the document actually make the case for this potential self-application of the label? It seems counterintuitive.
Well, the central argument presented in the source is basically this. If traditionalists fundamentally oppose the current culture, the values of modern society, right? But they still continue to benefit from everything that society and the state provide, infrastructure, services, stability, all of it does that make them hypocritical or even parasitical.
So using the system while rejecting it.
Exactly. The source frames it as benefiting from modernity whilst breaking society's expectation that we will perpetuate that culture in our own lives.
Okay, so the source is asking if living within and drawing benefits from a system you actively reject creates a kind of dependency, one that could be labeled parasitism by its own logic, perhaps.
That seems to be the implication being explored.
The document also touches on this idea of traditionalists trying to create parallel societies, doesn't it? Like separating themselves off.
It does. The source acknowledges that community is important. Yeah, and the idea of traditionalists extricating themselves from the, quote, voluntary facets of modern culture is discussed.
Right.
But the author argues that even when they try to create separate communities, traditionalists still inherently contribute to, and more significantly for this specific argument, benefit from the broader culture they oppose.
Can't escape it entirely.
Right. And they also benefit from governmental and social services.
Right.
The source seems to suggest it's incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, to be sustained entirely outside the system you inhabit.
This leads the source into a broader discussion about, well, the nature of culture itself. How does it contrast historical societies with modern ones in terms of culture and its role?
So the source claims that in, let's say, historical societies, there was a clear distinction. You had elites who perpetuated a high culture, think music, art, literature.
The classic.
Yeah, the classics. And lower classes could look up to that, aspire towards it. This high culture, according to the text, represented the nation at its highest level of achievement.
Okay, and how does that compare to now?
Well, in stark contrast, the source argues that in modern society, all are deemed both political and cultural standard bearers. There isn't that same hierarchy of aspiration, apparently.
Everyone's a standard bearer. And how does the source describe the output, the culture that comes from this modern landscape?
The source is quite critical here. It claims that in modernity, art and culture are, quote, manufactured not in the pursuit of perfection or truth, but as banal entertainment meant to briefly occupy the citizenry.
Banal entertainment. Ouch.
Yeah, the source kind of links this to a sense of listlessness or maybe lack of purpose it perceives in modern citizens.
And the document uses specific examples from pop culture, right?
Yep.
To illustrate this point about modern culture being tied to politics.
Yes, it does. It uses the prevalence of Star Wars references in political discourse as a key example.
Like Star Wars. Seriously.
Seriously. The source points to leftists comparing political components to Darth Vader. Justin Trudeau dressing as a Jedi, Ronald Reagan using it in the context of the USSR, the whole evil empire thing.
Right, remember that.
And even the White House posting an image of President Trump with a lightsaber. The source uses all these examples to show how popular culture, which it just described as banal entertainment, becomes sort of intertwined with political messaging across the whole spectrum.
That's a fascinating specific detail pulled right from the source. The document then goes back in history a bit, doesn't it, to support its point about culture being used for political ends.
Right, it goes further back. The source claims, for instance, that the U.S. government promoted jazz domestically after World War II, specifically to discourage classical music and deliberately subvert traditional European culture.
Wow. Okay. Any other examples?
Similarly, it claims the CIA actively promoted modern art, think abstract expressionism, that kind of thing, to counter and subvert the Soviet Union's emphasis on classical realism.
So deliberate cultural manipulation by governments.
The source presents these as historical instances of governments consciously using cultural forms for specific political or, geopolitical goals.
Okay. Let's move back to the discussion of traditionalists navigating modern society. The source also brings up the idea of exploiting the system as a form of resistance.
Yes, the document mentions that. Given what the author calls the immorality of the modern system, some individuals or groups might suggest traditionalists should actively exploit social services, maybe welfare programs, or even engage in schemes like buying goods purely to return them later.
Gaming the system, basically.
Yeah. The rationale discussed in the source is that if the system is seen as fundamentally corrupt or hostile, then exploiting it can be framed as a maybe legitimate form of resistance.
And what is the author's direct response to that specific idea within the source? Do they endorse it?
No, the author strongly rejects this.
Mm.
In the source, they call this behavior not honorable.
Not honorable.
Right. The author's argument is that, quote, behaving like a third worlder, even if it is to our short-term benefit, will only result in the West becoming indistinguishable from the third world.
That's a very stark warning presented in the source. It also links this kind of behavior or perceived behavior to a broader decline in societal expectations.
Yes, the source claims that as a society heterogenizes, which means, becomes more diverse in population and potentially culture, societal expectations tend to decline.
How so? Any examples?
It uses the example of plans in Great Britain to fine passengers playing music too loudly on public transport. The source describes this kind of public behavior as third world behaviors becoming more prevalent.
Okay.
And the consequence, it argues, is new laws or restrictions that end up penalizing everyone, just a general lowering of the public standard of behavior.
So according to the source, this perceived increase in certain negative behaviors from some groups leads to a general decline in public standards and more regulation for all.
Interesting. Okay, circling back to the traditionalist perspective and that central paradox.
Yeah.
How does the source characterize the state's relationship with traditionalists?
The document presents the state as fundamentally flawed. It says it defies reason and imperils the good. It even calls the liberal democratic state an existential enemy.
An existential enemy.
Yet, and this is crucial for the author's argument, it acknowledges that this very same liberal democratic system sustains us. It provides the framework, the safety, the services that traditionalists also live within, and importantly, benefit from.
And the author's point about this dynamic, what's the takeaway there?
The source argues that, in a kind of strange twist, the state is essentially subsidizing its own ideological opposition.
Funding its own critics.
Yeah.
In a way, yeah. By sustaining traditionalists, it allows their beliefs which are fundamentally antithetical to the state's foundational principles. As the source sees it, it allows those beliefs to be retained, sustained, and perpetuated.
Which brings us right back full circle to that central question of parasitism raised by the source.
Exactly. The source explicitly asks, right in this context, does being sustained by the state, an entity you view as an existential enemy, specifically for the purpose of perpetuating opposing beliefs, does that make traditionalists parasites?
Wow.
And the source draws a direct parallel, asking if this makes them no better than the Muslim who seeks to use the generosity of the state to finance the future caliphate of his desires. It really highlights the author's attempt to apply the same critical lens they used initially, but to a different group, forcing a kind of reevaluation of the term itself.
That's provocative. And the source also claims that traditionalists are perceived as parasites by their opponents, regardless of whether they're actually law-abiding citizens.
Yes. The document argues that from the perspective of their enemies, traditionalists are seen as parasitical simply for not upholding or perpetuating the state's dominant culture, even if they follow all the laws.
So just for disagreeing culturally.
Apparently. This is linked in the source to how traditionalists are often popularly depicted. The source claims they are presented as, quote, uneducated, antisocial, and uninspiring.
Those are loaded terms.
Very. The source then connects these traits to characteristics often associated with subsidized poverty, welfare use, and even a concept called dysgenics.
Dysgenics, what's that, briefly?
Broadly, it refers to the idea of societal decline linked to supposedly undesirable traits becoming more prevalent in the population. The source argues that society, as it's currently structured, seeks to eliminate or expunge groups associated with these perceived negative traits.
So the source ties together these different negative perceptions, uneducated, antisocial, linked to poverty or dysgenics, and connects them back to this idea of parasitism, but applied by the traditionalists' enemies to the traditionalists themselves.
That's the argument presented.
Okay. Finally, then, how does the author conclude their argument? How should traditionalists navigate living in this current society, according to this source? What's the prescription?
Well, the author's final point in the document is really a call for traditionalists to live differently. They argue that simply living according to current expectations isn't enough, and dishonoring something that, in their view, doesn't demand honor doesn't actually uplift you.
So complaining or checking out isn't the answer.
Not according to this author. Instead, the source suggests if their traditional principles are truly valid, then they should strive to live them out in a way that makes them the best representatives of our society, a spiritual elite.
Your spiritual elite. Okay. It sounds like the author is advocating for a kind of aspirational approach, maybe, rather than withdrawal or exploitation.
Precisely. The source uses the analogy of a serf aspiring to the virtues of nobility. This doesn't just uplift the serf's own station, but, according to the source, it encourages others, including the Lord in the analogy, to live up to their station's ideals as well.
So lead by example, essentially.
Yeah. The idea is to demonstrate the value of their principles through virtuous living, setting an example, rather than engaging in behaviors they critique in others, or just passively existing within a system they fundamentally oppose.
Okay, well, this deep dive into the source has certainly unpacked a complex and, like we said at the start, controversial set of arguments.
It really has. I mean, the document starts by presenting this application of the term parasitism to immigrant groups based on, financial reliance and this perceived cultural non-reciprocity.
Right.
But its main thrust, it seems to me, is turning that same critical lens back onto the very group, often making that initial claim, questioning if traditionalists themselves could be seen through a similar framework simply by living within and benefiting from a system they fundamentally oppose.
And it connects this central paradox to all these broader ideas, the nature of modern culture, the historical use of culture by the state, the very complex relationship between individuals holding dissenting views, and the society that sustains them.
hmm And finally, the author's specific view on honor and virtuous conduct in such a, conflicted situation.
Yeah, it definitely challenges easy definitions and forces you, the listener, to consider the multifaceted dynamics between individuals, groups, and the societal structures that support them, especially when there's profound ideological disagreement involved.
It really does. Lots to think about there.
Absolutely. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, drawn directly from the challenging ideas in this source. What is the nature of an individual's responsibility to the culture and society that sustains them, particularly when they are in deep, fundamental disagreement with its core values? And maybe even bigger, how does any society effectively navigate these inherent tensions? Something for you to consider based on this deep dive.